You arrive tonight carrying a silence you did not choose. A silence that was carved into you by years of absorbing the unspoken sorrows of others. And as you sit here before me, I see in your eyes an ancient exhaustion, the kind that does not come from the physical world, but from an encounter with the soul itself. There is a moment in every deeply feeling human being when something mysterious begins to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, like a faint tremor beneath the surface of a lake. You have carried the weight of other people's storms for so long that you no longer remember where your emotional body ends and theirs begins. But now, at the threshold of this closing year, the unconscious has begun to murmur a truth you have avoided hearing, that an empath does not awaken by caring more, but by caring differently, and eventually by caring less. I want you to feel the gravity of that sentence, not with your intellect, but with the somatic intelligence that lies deep in the belly, where instinct speaks in symbols rather than words. The moment the empath stops caring is not a collapse into numbness, nor a retreat into coldness. It is the moment the self demands its rightful place after decades of exile. If you have ever witnessed a forest reclaiming abandoned ruins, you have seen the same archetype at work. Life grows back into the space it once receded from. The same happens in your psyche. After years of shrinking so that others could expand within you, something ancient and sovereign begins to rise through the roots of your being. Most empaths misunderstand the nature of this threshold. They believe they are losing their compassion when in fact they are losing their illusions. They believe their heart is closing when it is finally becoming discerning. They believe they are becoming selfish when they are finally liberating themselves from the compulsive need to heal what does not want to be healed. The unconscious always seeks wholeness, not martyrdom, and it will withdraw its energy from anything that no longer contributes to the individuation of the soul. When you feel yourself stop caring, it is not the death of your humanity. It is the death of your self-abandonment. Every psychological transformation begins with what I have always called a necessary breakdown, a temporary disorientation in which the old dominant attitudes of the ego crumble under the pressure of forces it can no longer repress. You may have noticed in recent months that your patience for emotional chaos has thinned, that you no longer feel compelled to rescue people from the consequences of their own shadows, that the tears, the manipulations, the repeated cycles of crisis you once absorbed without question now strike you as strangely hollow. This is not cynicism, this is awakening. Cynicism is the collapse of hope. Awakening is the reclamation of self. What you are experiencing is the dismantling of a psychic contract you never consciously agreed to, the agreement to be the emotional container for the unprocessed wounds of others. There is a reason this dismantling feels like both rebellion and revelation. The empath archetype contains within it the wounded healer, the figure who believes salvation is found through carrying the burdens of others. But behind this archetype stands an even older one, the divine child, the original self, who refuses to be sacrificed any longer. When the divine child rises, it does not do so with aggression, but with an overwhelming clarity. You may wake one morning and feel an inexplicable calm, a quiet that seems almost supernatural, as if someone has lifted a veil from your perception. Suddenly, the dramas that once ensnared you feel distant, almost dreamlike, and you cannot understand why you ever believed they were yours to solve. This is the unconscious withdrawing its projections from the world. What you thought were obligations were illusions maintained by fear. There is a dream I often recall when speaking about this threshold. A patient once described standing in a large cathedral filled with people who were crying, screaming, begging for help. She ran from one to another, placing her hands on their shoulders, trying desperately to soothe them. But the more she tried, the louder their screams grew. Exhausted, she finally fell to her knees and buried her face in her hands. And in that moment of despair, she heard a voice behind her, gentle but unmistakably authoritative. She turned and saw a towering figure clothed in white light. He said only one sentence, "You are not the keeper of their suffering." When she awoke, she felt a peace she had never known. This is the dream of the empath at the final stage of awakening. It is the moment you understand that the cathedral is not the world but your psyche. The screaming people are the neglected complexes of others that you have allowed to occupy your inner sanctum. And the figure of light is yourself, demanding the return of its own temple. When the empath stops caring, what actually stops is the psychological enmeshment that made you believe your survival depended on being needed. To awaken spiritually is to confront a truth that the ego resists. You cannot heal anyone who is committed to their wound. Many people do not seek healing. They seek an audience for their suffering. They want to be seen bleeding, not stitched. They want to be held in their chaos, not guided toward clarity. And the empath sensitive, intuitive. Open becomes the perfect vessel for their unresolved shadows. You have been carrying stories that do not belong to you. You have been carrying guilt that was projected onto you. You have been carrying emotional weather systems that were never meant to be your climate. When the empath stops caring, these borrowed storms finally dissolve. The psyche begins to reorganize itself around its true axis rather than around the gravitational pull of other people's pain. You become aware of something astonishing, that your compassion was never the problem. Your boundaries were compassion without boundaries is self-erasure. Compassion with boundaries is power. And so, in this final stage, the empath begins to care, not less, but more selectively. You begin to ask, where does my energy actually create transformation? Where does it only perpetuate dependence? Where does my presence illuminate? And where does it become fuel for another's unconscious patterns? This discernment is not coldness, it is spiritual maturity. And it terrifies the people who once relied on your overextension. The moment you stop caring in the old way, they feel it in their shadows. They sense the withdrawal of your psychic energy, and they may respond with confusion, anger, guilt, or manipulation. They may accuse you of being different, distant, unloving, But understand this. When you step out of a role that was never yours, those who benefited from it will experience your liberation as a loss. This is unavoidable. The self-retrieval of the empath always appears to others as abandonment. But it is actually the first true act of inner loyalty. At this threshold, something else occurs, a shift in the symbolic architecture of your inner world. You may encounter dreams that feel like initiations, walking through deserts, crossing rivers, entering ancient temples, meeting animals with luminous eyes. These are not random images. They are archetypal markers of transition. When a person reclaims their psychic center, the unconscious sends symbolic confirmation. A wolf standing at the edge of a forest, watching you silently. A snake shedding its skin, leaving the old husk behind. A dilapidated house collapsing as you walk away. These symbols are the language of the soul announcing your transformation. One patient once dreamt of carrying a heavy clay pot filled with water everywhere she went. People dipped their hands into the pot, taking what they wanted, without asking. The water level dropped lower and lower until the pot became too heavy to lift. In the dream, she finally set the pot down and walked away. As she did, the pot cracked open, and a brilliant stream of water shot upward like a fountain, flowing endlessly from its center. When she awoke, she felt as though something had rewritten the structure of her being. The dream revealed a profound truth. The water was her life force, and it could only replenish itself when she stopped offering it to every thirsty hand. This is the stage you are entering. The pot is breaking. The fountain is rising. The moment the empath stops caring is the moment the inner well begins to refill. And once it does, you will notice a radical shift in your intuition. The empath who cares compulsively is clouded by emotional entanglement. The empath who has reclaimed their center sees with astonishing clarity. You will perceive intentions before they are spoken. You will sense who is drawn to your light and who is drawn to your wounds. You will know who is capable of meeting you at the level of soul and who only seeks the shelter of your emotional labor. This clarity is not a gift. It is a consequence of energetic sovereignty. There is another phenomenon that occurs at this stage, what I call the withdrawal of projection. For much of your life, you have projected your own potential for goodness, transformation, and growth onto others, believing that if you simply loved them enough, they would rise into their own wholeness. But projection distorts reality. It blinds you to who people truly are. When an empath stops caring, the projection dissolves, and you see the person, not the possibility. This is often painful. For the empath's projections are rooted in hope. The projection dissolves, and you see the person, not the possibility. This is often painful. For the empath's projections are rooted in hope, but without this dissolution, you cannot discern who actually belongs in your life and who merely occupies space. I have observed this process many times. The empath stops caring, and suddenly relationships collapse, not because of betrayal, but because of clarity The moment you no longer act as an emotional buffer, the true structure of the relationship reveals itself. Some connections will deepen, strengthened by authenticity. Others will disintegrate instantly, having been sustained only by your willingness to overextend. This collapse is not destruction, it is purification. Do not fear it. Before we continue, I want you to consider something profound, that stopping caring is the birth of the inner adult. The empath often remains suspended in a kind of psychological childhood, believing that love must be earned through service, that harmony is maintained through sacrifice, that abandonment is prevented through self-silencing. These are survival strategies, not conscious choices. They originate from wounds formed long before you possessed language. Many empaths endured chaotic households, unpredictable emotional climates, caregivers who oscillated between affection and withdrawal. In such an environment, the child becomes hyper-attuned to the moods of others, believing their safety depends on managing them. This is not empathy. It is vigilance masquerading as love. When the empath stops caring, what dies is the vigilant child, and what rises is the adult who realizes their survival no longer depends on emotional submission. This is why the moment feels both terrifying and liberating. A part of you believes you are committing a crime by withdrawing your care, but another part, deeper and older, whispers. Finally, this whisper comes from the self, which has always known that your primary obligation is to your own wholeness. Spiritual awakening is not an ascent into light, but a descent into the unconscious, where you retrieve the parts of yourself you abandoned in order to be loved. And when you gather those parts, when you reclaim your inner kingdom, something extraordinary occurs. You stop caring about things that once consumed you because they no longer resonate with the frequency of your emerging self. You will feel this shift somatically. The body always knows before the mind does. Certain conversations will suddenly feel unbearably draining. Certain people will feel like a contraction in your chest. You will sense your life force tightening around situations that diminish you, refusing to flow in directions that once felt familiar. This is your psyche aligning with truth. It does not negotiate. When the self withdraws its energy, the ego has no choice but to follow. And so, as we stand at the threshold of this inner transformation, I want you to understand the moment the empath stops caring is not the end of compassion. It is the beginning of spiritual authority. It is the reclaiming of your own psychic skin, the retrieval of boundaries that existed before the world taught you to relinquish them. It is the moment your soul says, with quiet certainty, I choose myself. And from that moment on, everything changes. There comes a peculiar stillness during this stage of awakening. A stillness so unlike the empath's previous life that it feels almost foreign, as if you have stepped into a version of yourself that has always existed, but remained hidden behind layers of emotional obligation. This stillness is not emptiness, it is spaciousness. It is the space that opens when you stop filling every crevice of your psyche with the noise of other people's crises. Many empaths misinterpret this spaciousness and believe something is wrong, that they are losing their sensitivity, that their heart is hardening, but the truth is that you are awakening to a higher form of sensitivity, a sensitivity not to the chaos of others, but to the whisper of your own soul. What you once called caring was often a reflex, not a choice. It was an instinct born of fear, fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of disappointing those whose approval you believed determined your worth. This fear masqueraded as compassion. But fear-based compassion is a distortion of the archetypal mother, the part of the psyche that nurtures not from compulsion but from abundance. When the empath stops caring, what dies is the counterfeit mother, the one who nurtures everyone except herself. In its place emerges the true mothering instinct, which includes the self as an object of care. This is why you may notice yourself longing for solitude in ways you never have before. The empath who is still entangled in the wounds of others fears solitude because their identity is built on relational usefulness. But the empath who has reached the threshold of awakening begins to crave solitude because it is within solitude that the self becomes audible. You may feel called to withdraw from certain conversations, gatherings, or emotional entanglements that once felt obligatory. Some people will interpret this as distance, but what you are actually doing is stepping back into your own psychic field, reclaiming the energy that was once scattered across dozens of unresolved stories. The unconscious supports this withdrawal. It orchestrates the timing of encounters, the fading of it orchestrates the timing of encounters, the fading of relationships, the rise of intuitive discomfort, all to guide you toward wholeness. You may experience synchronicities, subtle or dramatic, that confirm your withdrawal is necessary. Perhaps the moment you decide not to respond to someone's emotional demand, you receive a dream that symbolizes liberation. Perhaps you overhear a conversation that mirrors your inner conflict, or you stumble across a phrase in a book that feels as if it was written specifically for you. These are not coincidences. They are the self communicating in the language it prefers, symbolic alignment. When an empath stops caring in the old way, the entire psychic economy of their life shifts. For years, you may have run an internal system in which you were both the emotional laborer and the emotional resource. You managed the moods of others, soothed their wounds, held their projections, absorbed their anxieties. This system drained you, but you continued because the ego believed your value depended on your usefulness. When you stop caring, that system collapses, and with it collapses the identity that depended on it. This collapse can feel like a death, and in many ways it is. Spiritual awakening is always preceded by a symbolic death, the dissolving of the ego's false foundations so that the self may emerge with new authority. The moment the empath stops caring is the moment the psyche stops participating in relationships that depend on self-neglect. Suddenly, the empath feels a strange and disorienting neutrality in situations that once triggered panic or emotional urgency. You may find yourself unable to react with the same intensity, unable to play the roles others expect from you. It is as though your emotional body has stepped outside the old script, refusing to act in a play that no longer resonates with its truth. This neutrality is not indifference. It is the release of the ego's compulsive identification with suffering. Neutrality is the doorway to clarity. When you are no longer emotionally consumed by another's turmoil, you can finally perceive the deeper structure of the relationship. You begin to notice patterns that were invisible before, the subtle manipulations, the unspoken strategies for gaining your energy, the recurring cycles of crisis that reignite only when your attention wanes. You may realize that some people in your life do not want healing. They want access to your compassion because your compassion provides them with emotional anesthesia. It soothes their wound without requiring them to confront it. When you stop caring, you remove the anesthesia, and they must either face their shadow or seek another empath to numb it again. This recognition can be heartbreaking for the empath, for it reveals the shadow of their gift. The empathic ability to feel deeply, intuitively, and expansively is both a blessing and a vulnerability. But at this final stage of awakening, your gift begins to evolve. You no longer absorb emotions unconsciously. You observe them consciously. You no longer internalize the suffering of others. You witness it without merging with it. This is the beginning of energetic sovereignty, and it is one of the most profound transformations a sensitive soul can undergo. One dream shared with me by a patient exemplifies this shift. She dreamt of standing in a vast field of tall grass. Each blade of grass emitted a faint, sorrowful sound, as though the entire field were crying. For years she had walked through this field, gathering the grass in her arms, trying to comfort it. But in the dream she suddenly realized she was drowning in the voices, unable to hear her own, so she stopped. She stood still, and in that stillness, the crying faded, the field became quiet, the sky cleared, and she heard her own breath strong, steady, sovereign. She awoke with tears streaming down her face. For the dream revealed the essence of her awakening. The suffering she carried was not hers. And the moment she stopped trying to heal it, the world within her became quiet. This inner quiet is not a void, but a sanctuary. It is a place in the psyche where the ego finally yields to the self. Many empaths never reach this sanctuary because they are trapped in the archetype of the savior, believing they must heal others to justify their existence. But the savior complex is a shadow of empathy, a distortion created by wounds that have not yet been integrated. True empathy arises not from self-sacrifice, but from self-possession. When you possess yourself fully, your energy, your boundaries, your emotional truth, your presence becomes more healing than any act of rescue. It is not what you do for others that transforms them, but who you are when you no longer betray yourself. As the empath moves deeper into this awakening, they encounter an unexpected phenomenon, the return of instinct. Empaths often override instinct, believing it is unkind or judgmental to follow their intuitive signals. But instinct is not cruelty. Instinct is the voice of the unconscious attempting to guide you away from psychic danger. When the empath stops caring, instinct becomes audible again. You may feel an immediate contraction around certain people, not because you are becoming cold, but because your psyche is signaling incompatibility. You may sense an inner expansion around others, as though your energy recognizes theirs as